President Trump and President Zelensky discussed their now public phone call with reporters today at the United Nations.
We had, I think, good phone call. It was normal. We spoke about many things, and so I think, and you read it, that nobody pushed me. Yes.
In other words, no pressure.
Pressure is irrelevant. The only legal point that matters is that Donald Trump very clearly asked President Zelensky for help in trying to harm a candidate running for president against Donald Trump. That is now an irrefutable fact, and it is a fact big enough to get Donald Trump impeached. Joining our discussion now is Ambassador Wendy Sherman. As Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration, she was lead negotiator in the Iran nuclear deal. She's also an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. And Ben Rhodes, the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, is with us. He's an MSNBC political analyst. Ben, let me start with you. I know you've been on these calls. Yeah. You've been one of the number of people listening when it was President Obama. You've read these documents. This is my first. Yeah. I've never read one of these before today. It's my first. Yeah. I imagine your hands shaking holding this in your hands today.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence, I've actually got the transcript of every phone call President Obama made. So I've read hundreds and hundreds of those, and I've never, ever seen anything like this. I mean, first of all, you have to consider the context of Ukraine. And of course, the president of Ukraine is saying what President Trump wants to hear there. His country is besieged. You know, Crimea has been annexed. There are people being killed in eastern Ukraine. He is dependent on this aid, which is a lifeline for Ukraine. And for the President of the United States to essentially be leveraging aid that is a lifeline to a country that has been invaded by an adversary of the United States, because all he cares about is not the national interest, not the people of Ukraine. All he cares about is his own political interest, is the definition of corruption. And I have to tell you, Lawrence, the other thing I think, we know about this because of the whistleblower. There's one little window opened onto one phone call. Where else is this happening? You know, if this is, you know, everything we know about how Trump operates, is this happening with Saudi Arabia? Is this happening with Russia, right? So to me, this is a peek at how Trump actually operates. And what that shows you is the complete and utter corruption of American foreign policy.
Wendy Sherman, your reaction?
My reaction is quite similar. I found that press conference so painful today. Zelensky was trying so hard to walk this very difficult line, flattering the president, saying he didn't get pressured, while at the same time saying we're an independent country. I can't ask a prosecutor to do a particular something. He was trying to show he's not a corrupt leader, which is essential in modern Ukraine, given its history. And at the same time, he had to sit next to the president of the United States, who said, hey, why don't you and Putin get together and sort of work this problem out? Putin is killing his people. Just extraordinary.
Yeah, Ben, the underlying policy with Ukraine is one of the things that isn't getting focused on much here. But I do want to show that moment of Donald Trump today. Here is President Zelensky in what he calls a war. He used the word war today repeatedly, publicly, about his situation with Russia. And here is what Donald Trump said about that.
I really hope that Russia, because I really believe that President Putin would like to do something, I really hope that you and President Putin get together and can solve your problem. That would be a tremendous achievement. And I know you're trying to do that.
Ben, this is FDR telling Winston Churchill, I hope you can work this out with Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, Putin has taken a piece of the territory of Ukraine. Putin is backing people, arming people who are killing people in eastern Ukraine. This is enormous. We spent the last 2.5 years of the Obama administration, and Wendy was front and center in this too, mobilizing the Europeans to impose sanctions on Russia, figuring out what assistance packages could go to Ukraine to help them weather this incredible storm they're in. And Donald Trump sees this as nothing more than kind of a mere sideshow. What he cares about is, on that call, talk to Rudy Giuliani, talk to Bill Barr, talk to my kind of personal lawyers, and it's, first of all, a bad thing that the Attorney General seems to be a personal lawyer for the President of the United States, about this completely meaningless corruption investigation. Because the other thing I'd say, and Wendy was there too, the decision to recommend that they get rid of that prosecutor was an interagency process. Interagency meaning the State Department comes together, the NSC at the White House and others. This person was at the heart of a lot of corruption, had nothing to do with Hunter Biden. So he's inventing conspiracy theories to suit his own politics and asking a man who just got elected to a country that has been invaded by its neighbor to facilitate those conspiracy theories. And on the issue that really matters, that Russia invaded his country, he's saying, oh, I hope you work it out. I'm sure Putin's committed to doing that. That's taking Putin's side, just like he did in Helsinki when he said Putin didn't really interfere in our election.
Mm-hmm. And Wendy, the Europeans wanted this prosecutor out of the way
Absolutely.
in Ukraine because they felt that just nothing serious was happening with this prosecutor.
Absolutely. The Europeans were very much in line with what we were trying to do to get rid of this corrupt prosecutor. And the other thing here is the whole reason we're here is because that Ukraine needed military aid. It wanted, as he said today, those javelins. And the president knew that created leverage. And you see how that comes up in the conversation. The president says, yes, but there really hasn't been any reciprocity. And I'd like to ask you a favor, though. And so we know that this is all connected. And so when people say there's nothing direct here, I think it's plain as day.
Ben, how many people would have heard a phone call like this and would be aware of the contents of a phone call like this?
A pretty good number, Lawrence. I mean, you'd have several people in the Oval Office for that call. The leadership of the NSC staff, the relevant people who work on Ukraine in the NSC, then people like your guest, Larry Pfeiffer, who we worked with in the Situation Room listening and making a record of the call. And then usually the transcript is disseminated. And the reports seem to suggest that part of what got the attention of the whistleblower is that they were handling this call differently, that they were trying to restrict access to the transcript of this call. I think it's also very important for your viewers to understand it's not just this transcript. What else was going on? Why was Rudy Giuliani flying out to Ukraine? Why was the State Department, again, based on the reports we've read, directing Rudy Giuliani to be involved in this at all? He's a private citizen who represents the President of the United States. So we shouldn't see this transcript as the end of the story. I think it's, again, a window into a much broader corruption of our policy towards Ukraine, towards Russia, and front and center in all these matters is not the American people. And keep in mind, that's our tax dollars. That assistance going to Ukraine, that's our tax dollars being used like a part of Trump's campaign war chest to leverage, again, a foreign leader to do his bidding. And so I'd like to see us pull all these different threads on terms of what was going on around not just this phone call, but Ukraine policy generally.
Wendy, all these years on the call, one whistleblower, only one.
Yes, I think we're at a time where people are terrified. To become a whistleblower, you have to be pretty sure of what you're doing. And if you're an intelligence officer, you know that your life is on the line and that intelligence officers work not to be known by people. They work to be quietly doing the work to protect us and protect our national security. So for this whistleblower, knowing particularly this president and this administration, which believes in punishing people, after all, the president talked about our then ambassador to Ukraine, who he basically said was doing bad things and he was going to take care of her, which he did, which is to push her out of government. This is a punitive administration. And so this whistleblower must have really believed there was corruption here. And we saw the president, as he always does, he talks about how everybody else is corrupt to deflect from his own deep corruption.
Ben, I think the disturbing thought of the night, I think, for the audience is this is just one phone call.
Yeah. Yes.
This is just one phone call, one whistleblower. Ambassador Wendy Sherman, Ben Rhodes, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.